All right, guys, let's talk about firing your pottery and glazing your pottery. So before you can glaze it, you will need to fire it, and all you have to do to fire it is leave it for me to fire. You don't actually have to do anything. So you'll leave it on the ready to fire shelf, and when it was returned to you, it will look like this. It'll be nice and hard, almost sort of glass-like. That happens because the kiln heats up to a super high temperature and it chemically changes the nature of the clay to where it becomes like stone. This is very, very hard and it's not crumbly anymore. Now you can still throw it down and like smash it, but whereas your piece right now before it is fired would be very crumbly, this is not crumbly, it's very strong. So after you have gotten it fired, the next step will be to glaze it. And so that you can make it bright and colorful. The glaze is very similar to paint, but before you can do that, you have to apply wax to the bottom. So I have this little jar of wax, and you're going to apply it using one of these nasty brushes right here, because I don't want to ruin any more perfectly good brushes. So you're gonna go like this and just kind of like dip it in here and just kind of spread it on here. The wax prevents the glaze from sticking to the bottom of the pottery in case you accidentally get some on here. You probably will. Most kids do accidentally get some glaze on the bottom of their pottery. So it makes it where you can go back and easily clean the bottom of your pot before you fire it for the second time. This does not, the wax on its own doesn't do anything. The wax makes it so that you can clean your pottery. You still have to go back and clean it. I have so many kids, you're like, well, I put wax on it. I'm like, yeah, but then the wax made it so you could clean it and you didn't go clean it. So the wax keeps the glaze from sticking to the pottery. And the reason you don't want glaze on the bottom of your pottery is because the glaze, it goes on wet because there is water added to it, but the glaze is basically a powder. And if the powder, when the powder is in the kiln, it will melt basically, and that's what causes it to form this glassy surface. If it melts on the bottom of your pottery, it will glue your pot to the shelf, and our only option will be to get a chisel and just destroy it to get it off my shelf. And if it destroys the shelf too, then you owe me a new shelf. So you have to put wax on the bottom of your pottery so that you can then go back and clean the bottom of your pottery, remove the glaze from it, and then fire it again. The wax will stay on now, but the wax will melt off in the kiln and it'll evaporate and it'll go away. So when you get your pot back, it will have glaze on the sides, but the wax will melt away. You don't have to clean the wax off. You just have to clean the glaze off of the wax. So once this dries, then you paint your pottery and then you flip it back over to look at the wax and see like little speckles of glaze that accidentally got on the bottom. You get a wet paper towel and you wipe them right off. So I would recommend doing this part, the wax, maybe the class period before you're planning to glaze. But if you don't have time, you can probably get them all done in one period. Like this is already starting to dry. You see these darker spots where it's starting to dry. But probably a decent idea if you know I'm gonna glaze tomorrow, spend 5 minutes putting wax on the bottom of your piece. So I'm gonna set this aside. And I'm gonna show you one over here that already has wax on the bottom. This one, it also has a hole in the bottom. This was intended to be like a little planter. I think like it had a little saucer that it set in. That's why it has a hole. The hole has nothing to do with the wax. But this one got wax all over the sides, which is why the person didn't follow through with it, because this, the only way to get this off would be to put it in the kiln and let it evaporate and come back out of the kiln and then put wax on it again and then glaze it. You can't scrape this off. If you get it on there, I mean, you can try to scrape it off a little bit. You can try to use a hair dryer to warm it up and get some of it off, but it's probably still gonna be there. And it's not gonna make your pot green, it's just gonna make your pot white. So you'll have to work around that. Anyway, but I'm gonna show you how to glaze after you have applied the wax. So I have here just a regular paintbrush. They make fancy glaze paintbrushes that are much better for this, and I quit buying them after people kept destroying them. So I have my glaze. I have picked out candy apple. It will look like this at some point. It does not look like that right now. It looks pink. All glazes are going to fire darker and brighter than they currently appear. So keep that in mind as you are choosing colors. It will not look like what it looks like in the bottle. The picture on the front is the best representation of what it will look like. So this is what it looks like right now. Definitely doesn't look like this super bright red that we have here. All right, I had to open that one up, but now that I've got the foil off the top, these glazes do need to be shaken for a decent amount of time before you start. Especially if you are using one of the glazes that has crystals in them. I do have a few of those. This is a really crappy pot, but this is one of the glazes that has crystals in it. And you can see it creates like splotches of color. So you can use those. I'm not sure how many I have. I've ordered more, but they probably will not be here in time for you to do your pinch pot, but hopefully they should be here in time to do your mug or your coil pot. Just keep in mind that these glazes, the crystal glazes, are not food safe. You could not eat out of this afterwards. But all glazes need to be shaken. The crystal glazes need to be shaken extremely well. So I have shaken this one. And now I can start painting my pottery. I'm obviously not gonna do this whole thing because you don't wanna sit and watch me do that, but I'm gonna do a little bit. I'm going to just dip straight out of here. If you're only using one color, that's fine. If you are using more than one color, you need a different brush for each color, or you need to walk to the sink and wash in between. If you contaminate my glazes, you will have to buy me a new one, and these are, I wanna say like maybe $12, $13 each. Please don't contaminate the glazes. If you're afraid of that, just get a thing of like a paint palette and pour a little bit out. Just don't be wasteful and don't try to scoop it back in there either. Okay, so I'm gonna go on this. This goes on just about like paint does. And you can see these areas where I got it on the wax. It doesn't stick there. That's very easy to wipe off, whereas up here, it's very difficult to clean off. Okay, we're gonna pretend like this section right here is my whole pot. Like I say, I don't want to make you sit and watch, even in time-lapse mode, watch me do this whole thing. Okay, so I have one coat on. It is important to remember that this is going to dry to like a powder. It will be super, super matte when it dries. And then we will fire it. When we fire it, it will melt and fuse back together to form a surface all over your pot. If this amount of glaze were to melt and reform, there would be huge patches when it reformed that would be left uncovered. You need depends on how thick your coats are, but I would say at least 2 thick coats, which I wouldn't recommend doing thick coats. I would recommend doing thin coats because look how fast this has dried. Since I have been talking, it's almost completely dry. So I would recommend doing 3 thin coats like this, possibly even 4 if you're doing really thin coats, but 2 to 4 coats, 3 is the safe place to land. I would stick with 3 because you also don't want it to be too globby and like melt down the side of your pot. These glazes are supposed to be good about not melting, or not dripping at least. They'll all melt, but some of them melt worse than others and tend to drip a lot. So there's my second coat. This again, it will completely dry in a matter of 1 to 2 minutes and I can be ready for my next coat. Something else to keep in mind though, if I have red here and then maybe if I want to put blue polka dots on it, if I were to put blue polka dots on top of this red, they might turn out blue, but there's a pretty decent chance that the blue would layer over the red and they would melt together and your polka dots would come out more purple. That's not to say that will always happen. If you do 3 coats of blue on top, you might be okay. You might be able to get that blue to really come through, but just kind of think about that. These glazes that I buy mix predictably. So like a red and a blue mixed together will make it purple. Most glazes do not do that. These are much more artificial than most real glazes. I used to buy like artist quality glazes and my kids hated them. So I started buying the student quality ones because you can predict which colors it's going to be and which colors are going to mix. So I'm going to show you now. So like I said, this color is what it goes on like. This color is what it comes out like. All of the colors are going to come out way brighter and darker than you expect they will. They are going to come out looking exactly like they do on the jar. So keep that in mind. Don't think you're getting like this pretty pastel color when you're really getting something super bright. I do have pastel colors and they go on even lighter in order to come out that light. You can also hear this one. It is very glass-like. Like I said, they melt together and then they fuse to form basically like a glass. So this is what your pot will come out looking like after you have fired it again. So once you have finished glazing it, you will go back and you will clean off all of the glaze that got on the wax. You leave the wax stays there, it will melt off on its own. You don't have to do anything. You just have to clean off the wax. Then you will put it back on the ready to be fired shelf. I will fire it for you and you will get something like this back. If you have any questions, as always, let me know. Popping back in for one more second. Clean these brushes. I don't want to clean up after you. Don't leave them in the sink. If you used a paint palette because you didn't want to contaminate the glaze on accident, clean that. I don't want to clean up after you. Clean your brushes, wash them really good, because other kids have to use these for paint. So make sure that you're not leaving gunked up glaze in my paint brushes, please. Clean up after yourself.